All right, we'll talk about themes of the book of Esther in a little bit here, but I think the main thrust of the book can be summed up by this statement that's on the slide. And who knows whether you have attained royalty for such a time as this. What's being considered in that statement? What would we call that? Providence. Exactly. God's providence. And when we get into an overview of the book itself, we'll talk a little bit more about the idea of where God is in the book of Esther. Because, as you may or may not know, there is no mention of God in the book of Esther. But for now, let's just start with the fact that he's not mentioned there. There are no prophets. There are no dreams. God does not speak directly to anyone or give anyone a sign. So other than the law and the prophets that the Jews might have access to read and hear, there's no direction that's given to either Esther or Mordecai, our sort of two primary protagonists in the story. Now, I don't know about you, but that's how my life also happens to work. God doesn't talk to me. There are no signs. There's no miracles. The only direction that I have is what? We have the Word of God. We have the Scriptures. And so we know how we're supposed to live, and we know the things that we are supposed to do and the attitudes that we're supposed to take. But we don't have any direct intervention from God in our lives. Now, just because we can't see it, does that mean it's not there? I see heads shaking. That's the right answer. I have the written word of God, but beyond that, God has not spoken to me directly. He hasn't given me any signs. I'm sure most of you have experienced moments in time where we stopped and asked God, what do you want me to do here? What am I supposed to do? You've got some choices, and all of the choices either seem equally okay or equally good or equally bad sometimes. And we make those decisions to the best of our ability, and we trust in the providence of God to take care of things. Now, before I get any further, I want to say we've got some scriptures. I'm going to ask for volunteers to read this morning, but beyond this morning, what I'd really like is if you're willing to read, send me a text or an email or come tell me, and next week I will have little printed pieces of paper with scriptures on them to hand out so that we can save some time on reading. So if you're willing to read and you're here, I'll hand you a piece of paper when you come in, and then we can just do it that way. It'll be a little easier. All right. So, a question. Have you experienced God's providence in your own life? I see some heads nodding. All right, Steve, if you've experienced God's providence in your own life, how do you know?
Well, I don't know that you know specifically, but I've often said that if you are an individual that pays a little bit of attention to things, that every once in a while in life, you're pretty sure that you catch the hand of God in working, and we call it providence. But you know, it's just like in the stories that we read in the Bible. There's just, if you look at things in circumstance after circumstance after circumstance, just how they line up, and then if you're logical and you say there is no way that all of those things could have lined up just like that by pure coincidence, that you absolutely believe that God's hand was involved in that.
So we take it on faith. When good things happen, we attribute them to God. That's what we a lot of times consider providence. We don't usually understand it in advance, do we? Providence is something that we generally look at in retrospect. That this was providential. How does Mordecai consider the idea of providence? And I'll go ahead and answer that because obviously we haven't started our study in the book of Esther yet. But I would ask you, now that I'm thinking about it, go ahead and read the whole story. It's meant to be taken as one unit. It's 10 chapters. If you read 2 chapters a day, you'll get through it in 5 days. If you don't want to do that, at least read the first 2 chapters before our class next week. but it's meant to be taken as a whole, meant to be looked at as a whole. So Mordecai looks to the future, and he offers what I would consider a qualified statement here on the slide. He says, who knows? And that's how I understand providence as well when I'm looking at it. Who knows? I don't know for sure, but I'm going to make an assumption that if things are working out well for me, that it is the hand of God in it. We attribute good things to God. And you're inevitably going to run into people who say things like, and Jesus told me to do this, or God wanted me to do that. Those are statements that I'm not willing to make. It's a little, I'd love to pause and correct that worldview sometimes, but there's not enough time usually just in conversation to do that. And that's not really the place to start doing that either. There's some other things that we have to lay the groundwork for, but that's not how we understand things. Jesus does not tell us to do things beyond what's in the Scripture. God does not speak to us beyond what's in His Word. And attributing things to God is a potentially risky proposition, isn't it? What if things don't work out quite the way you thought they were? What if things work out better than you think they should have? Because a lot of times when you look at things, you think, wow, this is really, I was struggling here, and 10 years later, it was, well, my struggles here turned out good for someone else. That's also providence. So Mordecai's understanding of providence lines up with how I believe we should all view providence, through the lens of potential. He's looking at potential here in this statement that he makes to Esther. This could be a good thing. And good things come from God. Therefore, in the event that this works out well, God gets the credit. Also, sometimes that look like they didn't work out well turn out to have broader implications than we realize. And God's will is still done. In fact, that's one of the things that we will look at in the book of Esther, is there's this series of occurrences followed by reversals later. Haman does something that's later reversed. Something bad happens that's later turned into something good. That's also God's providence. That's also how God operates in a lot of cases. One of my favorite statements in the Bible is something that Joseph said. What did Joseph say about providence?
You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good.
Exactly. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. That is providence at work right there. God's will is always done. And that's one of the messages of the book of Esther. Now, in order to get a better grasp of what's happening in Esther, let's take some time to look at the history and context. Where are we in the book of Esther? What's the location? Okay, Persia. Persian Empire. What do we know about the Persian Empire? Okay, it was large and covered a lot of territory. That is, it was, to that date, the largest empire of its kind. What else do we know about Persia?
Militarily strong.
Okay, militarily strong. They had conquered the previous empire, which was the Babylonians. All right. And so in Daniel's vision of the Babylonians, you'll remember the Babylonians were the head of gold, and then you had some other parts. Which parts were the Persians? They were the silver, right? They're the next bit. They came right after the Babylonians. So you had the Medo-Persian Empire that immediately followed Babylon as the next world empire. All right. Let's find out how the Jews ended up in Persia. And to answer that question, I want to go all the way back to Egypt. Here's a chronology of the Bible, a timeline. That is big enough. Excellent. I was hoping it would be. By the way, I cannot take full credit for this slide deck. When I mentioned to my dad that I was teaching the book of Esther, he said, "Oh, I've got slides." And I said, great, I'll take a look at them and I'll use as many of them as I can. And I looked at them and I said, I'm going to use all of them. So here's a chronology of the Bible. And we're going to start all the way back in Egypt in approximately 1875 BC. Jacob migrates with his household to Egypt. Why? What's going on? Okay, there is a famine. If we read Exodus chapters 42 through 46, which I'm not going to take the time to do this morning, we'll document Jacob and his sons migrating to Egypt because of a severe famine in the land of Canaan where they were living at the time. But Egypt had food. Why did Egypt have food? Okay, because Joseph was there, and he interpreted Pharaoh's dream about the 7 years of plenty and the 7 lean years. He made sure that there was food stored up. So Joseph had the foresight to store up the food for the lean years. Jacob hears that there's bread in Egypt. He sends his sons down there. There's the whole interchange with Joseph, and then they all end up moving down there. How long do the Hebrews then spend in Egypt? Okay, about 400 years. Exodus chapter 12 and verse 40 tells us that the Hebrews were in Egypt for 430 years. It says the time that the Israelites lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of 430 years, on that same day, all the Lord's divisions went out from the land of Egypt. It was a night of vigil in honor of the Lord because he would bring them out of the land of Egypt. This same night is in honor of the Lord, a night vigil for all the Israelites throughout their generations. So, supposedly on the exact same day that they settled in the land of Egypt, they left the land of Egypt. And then, let's see, I need a volunteer to read Exodus chapter 1, verses 8 through 14. All right, go ahead, Steve.
Exodus chapter 1, verses 8 through 14. Now there arose a new king over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramesses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves.
All right. So, one of the problems that the Egyptians came to have with the children of Israel who were living in the land of Goshen there is that they actually outnumbered the Egyptians. And so the Egyptian king, the Pharaoh, reasoned that if war were to break out and the Hebrews decided to fight on the other side, they were in trouble. So he oppresses them. All right. So the next question is, what prompted the Hebrews to leave the land of Egypt?
God, through various miracles, plagues, all these things will work. All these things work together, especially the plagues, especially the 10th plague.
Okay. So in addition to this oppression, later on in Exodus, we see that the children of the Hebrews they tried to restrict them, told the midwives to kill the male babies that were born. They refused to do that. In any case, there's some pressure here. And so they migrate out of the land of Egypt. That leaves us with an approximate Exodus date of 1445 BC. Now, how would you characterize the Israelites as they travel from Egypt to Canaan? What was the character of that group of people, that nation? Disobedient. Okay. What are some other words that God uses to call them? Stiff-necked. So stubborn. What is? Okay, murmurers. Well, how does Moses refer to them at one point? Because they've done it a few times. Shall we bring water for you, you rebels? All right, so they're rebellious, they're stubborn, they're stiff-necked, they're complainers. And as a result, what happens to them?
They have to wander in the wilderness for 40 years.
Okay, now not only do they have to wander in the wilderness for 40 years, but what happens to that whole generation while they're there? They die. Not one of them is allowed to enter the land of Canaan except for two people. Well, two people that are non-Levites. Who are the two non-Levites that are allowed to enter into the land? Caleb and Joshua. All right. So, a new generation, 40 years later, enters the land of Canaan and conquers it. And we just finished studying Ruth. And looking at that pattern of history in Judges, I need a volunteer to read Judges chapter 2, verse 10, and then verse 16 through 19. Got any other readers here? All right. I see Brandon. Thank you, Brandon.
Judges 2:10, you said?
Yes.
And all that generation also were gathered to their fathers, and there arose another generation after them, who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel.
And then verse 16 through 19 also.
Then the Lord raised up judges, who saved them out of the hands of those who had plundered them. Yet they did not listen to their judges, for they whored after other gods and bowed down before them. They soon turned aside from the way in which their fathers had walked, who had obeyed the commandments of the Lord, and they did not do so. Whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he saved them from the hands of their enemies all the days of that judge. For the Lord was moved by pity by their groaning because of those who afflicted and oppressed them. But whenever the judge died, they turned back and were more corrupt than their fathers, going after other gods, serving them and bowing down to them. They did not drop any of their practices or their stubborn ways.
All right. So we're starting to see a pattern emerge here. How long was the period of the judges and what ended it? If you need a hint, you can look up on the overhead behind me. About how long was it? About 400 years, okay? So it ends around 1050 BC when what happens? Okay, we've got the first king. Saul is appointed king. Why is he appointed king? What's going on there? All right, the people asked for a king. They came to Samuel and they said, we don't like your sons. Why don't you appoint a king for us to be a judge over us, and just like all the other nations that are around us? Now, Saul was appointed king, and it turns out that giving the people what they wanted was a great idea. The nation was saved. Everyone got what they wanted. God was glorified, right? No. All right. Apart from the reign of Solomon, the United Kingdom is constantly at war. You have war under Saul. Saul is fighting with the Philistines. There's oppression with the Philistines. It's not until David that most of the oppression from external nations is finally thrown off. But then David's reign is characterized by what? We've got a couple of wars of expansion. We've got a civil war. There's no peace. In fact, God calls David a man of war and refuses to let him build the temple. So you have peace under Solomon. And I want to make a quick side note about the whole giving the people what they wanted and appointing a king. I want you to think about, just for a moment, what happens in the Bible usually after the phrase, listened to the voice of the people? Is it something good or is it something bad? Something bad. Does that tell us something about the concept of democracy? Maybe it does. Do we get good leaders when we give the people what they want? Something to ponder. All right, so then Rehoboam becomes king, and what happens? Okay, we have the split. The kingdom splits into Israel and Judah. So you have the kings of Judah in the south, you have the kings of Israel in the north, and how does the nation fare in that time? How would you characterize the people and their relationship with God? Okay, rampant idolatry. You've got some good kings in the kingdom of Judah. How many good kings are there in the kingdom of Israel? Pretty much none, all right? The best one of the lot is probably Jehu, and Jehu still doesn't get rid of the golden calves that Jeroboam sets up initially. So the nation of Israel has problems with idolatry from the very start. Now, how do you think that that's something that just happened? You know, Jeroboam says we're going to set up the golden calves, and man, it takes a while for the people to kind of get used to the idea. Or do you kind of get the feeling that this is sort of par for the course for them? That maybe even under David and Solomon, in spite of the fact that David and Solomon were good kings, and the worship of God was done as it should have been, that the heart of the people in general never really seems fully oriented towards God. And you have a couple of kings of Judah who force the issue a little bit. Go ahead, Scott.
The people have always been steeped in idolatry. It starts with the golden calf. You go from there all through the period of Judges, they're serving idols. And in fact, there's a story in Judges where you have the migration of the tribe of Dan, but they, in essence, follow a person who is a descendant of Moses, who they make idols and shrines. And the interesting thing is they settle in Bethel, which is where one of the golden calves is put. So the people are prone to our idolatry, and you can see that from way back. And you can now kind of understand why there really wasn't much resistance when Jeroboam put up the golden calf in Bethel.
Exactly. So, there's not really a whole lot of resistance. All right, so then what happens in 722 BC? All right, Assyria happens. God finally gets tired of the idolatry of the nation of Israel. Assyria conquers the northern kingdom of Israel and relocates the people back into other parts of Assyria and moves other conquered people into the land of Israel. So in the time of Jesus, who do those people have become? All right, those are the Samaritans. So then Judah took note of what happened to the northern tribes and turns it around. Now, what happens in 605 BC? All right, Babylon invades. And the first Babylonian invasion of the southern kingdom of of Judah doesn't wipe them out, but the first load of hostages are taken back to Babylon. What finally happens in 586 BC? I know, we skipped one, but... Okay. Jerusalem is sacked. The wall is broken, the temple is torn down, and all but the poorest people are then deported to Babylon. Could I get somebody to read 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verses 20 through 21? I don't see any hands, so I'll go ahead and read that. He deported those who escaped from the sword to Babylon, and they became servants to him and his sons until the rise of the Persian kingdom. This fulfilled the word of the Lord through Jeremiah, and the land enjoyed its Sabbath rest all the days of the desolation until 70 years were fulfilled. All right, the language here is really interesting. Was it just that the Israelites had disobeyed God? Was it just that the Israelites had served other gods? What was the other thing that God really sticks it to them for, and why did he keep them for exactly 70 years? They hadn't observed the Sabbaths. They hadn't given the land its rest. And so God enforces that. He says, all the days of its desolation, it kept Sabbath until 70 years were complete. So God gives the land the rest that it should have had. Now, during this exile, we have a couple of prophets. Who are the two prophets that we are familiar with in Babylon? No, they led the guys out of Babylon. We're talking about during the Babylon period. Who are the prophets? All right, Daniel and Ezekiel were the contemporary prophets there in Babylon. Now, Jeremiah was contemporary with both of them, but he was actually in Judah. He never made it to Babylon. So during this exile, Daniel and Ezekiel serve as the Lord's prophets to the people in captivity, as well as Daniel being highly positioned in the Babylonian government, and then later in the Medo-Persian Empire. So he's an important figure all the way through when the Persians take over from the Babylonians. What happens in 536 BC? Okay, I heard it over here. King Cyrus lets them return. I want you to turn over to 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verses 22 through 23. Well, that's Daniel there. Hang on a second. All right, we'll get to that in a second. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, the word of the Lord spoken through Jeremiah was fulfilled. The Lord put it into the mind of King Cyrus of Persia to issue a proclamation throughout his entire kingdom, and also to put it in writing. This is what King Cyrus of Persia says. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and has appointed me to build him a temple at Jerusalem in Judah. Whoever among you of his people may go up, may the Lord his God be with him. All right, now here we have in Daniel chapter 9, verse 2, that Daniel says, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, observed in the books the number of the years which was revealed as the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet for the completion of the desolation of Jerusalem, namely, 70 years. So Daniel probably went over with that first group of captives. He's been there that whole time. He's observed that the time is up. And so he goes and inquires of the Lord about that. So in 536, you have the first return of the exiled people back home. That's under Zerubbabel, by the way, and this is also contemporary with the prophets Haggai and Zechariah. The temple is rebuilt during that time, but not the wall. So then you have in 457 BC, there's a second return under Ezra, and then a third return under Nehemiah in 445 BC, when the wall is finally rebuilt. Let's see if I can get that to advance. Come on. I know you want to go. Someone want to advance me one? Clicker not working. All right. Everything described in the book of Esther points to it being during the reign of Xerxes I of Persia, between the return under Zerubbabel and the return under Ezra. So you have this window of time between 536 and 457 when the events of Esther probably occurred. Still not advancing. All right. Sorry, that's a little distracting. There's reasonable evidence that the book was probably written in the late 5th century BC. Later Jewish writings adopt the Babylonian system of recording dates. And since the events take place in the early 5th century, this gives us a fairly narrow window for when the book was likely recorded. All right, so we did the 2 Chronicles. All right, Isaiah chapter 44 and verse 28, who says to Cyrus, my shepherd, he will fulfill all my pleasure, and says to Jerusalem, she will be rebuilt, and of the temple its foundation will be laid. Okay, they're signaling the 1 minute here. All right, we'll keep going. The Persian Empire lasted from 539 BC until 329 BC, when, as prophesied by Daniel, it fell to the Greeks under Alexander the Great. Between 545 and 538 BC, the Persian kings conquered the whole of the Middle East, including Palestine, and established the largest of all the empires in the ancient world. Cyrus, in particular, was responsible for a large portion of the extension of the empire's borders. During his military conquests, he was well known for treating the people of his empire with respect. He saw himself as a liberator rather than a tyrant. I've lost it completely. Cyrus was followed by Cambyses II, who spent much of his time trying to advance into Egypt, and then by Darius I, who mostly consolidated the empire and developed its administrative structures, which we see happening in the book of Daniel. Darius also built a palace at Susa, which is going to be mentioned here in the book of Esther. And after Darius came Xerxes the First. That's most likely the name Ahasuerus that we read about in the book of Esther. Now, Xerxes the First is famous. Anybody know what he's famous for? Yeah, he's famous for Thermopylae. That's not something you really want to be famous for, because he had an army of at least about 350,000. Herodotus calls it millions, but it was probably closer to hundreds of thousands of people. It got held off by 7,000 Greeks. We're good. All right. Whoops. Okay, got it. Hey, there we go. There's the Persian Empire. That's what I was trying to show you. All right, so the purple stuff is what was captured by Cyrus. And then Cambyses is the yellow, so his campaign's over in Egypt. And as you can see, Cyrus conquered most of that. Cambyses conquered a little bit. And then Xerxes temporarily makes inroads into Thrace, headed towards Greece. Never actually makes it very far into Greece. He's thrown back out. So you have Thermopylae, in which 7,000 Greek soldiers held off the Persian army of at least 350,000, which, if you're doing the math, and I did, that's about 50 times their size. A fraction of the army was deployed as a rear guard while the rest of the army retreated. However, most of the historical evidence that we have for this time period comes from Herodotus. Anyone know who Herodotus is? What his nationality is? Can you take a guess from his name? He's Greek. So if you're a Greek historian and you're writing about Greek history, you might be a little bit biased against the Persians. So we understand that there might be a little bit of bias in Herodotus' writing about this time period. But his writings do bear evidence to Persian personalities and practice. In addition, we have what's called the Behistun inscription of Darius that contains some Persian records of Xerxes' empire. In them, Xerxes was portrayed as a successful ruler who put down revolts in Babylon and Egypt and destroyed the temple and statue of the Babylonian god Marduk in response to that particular rebellion. All right. One other thing of note about the Persian Empire. When you're building an empire in the ancient world, one of the key elements to expanding and retaining your territory is what? Think about it for a second. If you were the king and you put out a decree, what do you have to have happen?
You have to make sure everybody's represented in their own languages. You have to account for all the different languages that are in that territory.
Okay, you've got to account for all the different languages that are in that territory, so communication is important. You've also got to make sure that that decree goes all the way out to the farthest corners of your empire. Ancient empires were actually limited by two things. One was how far you can move an army, and the other one was how far you can get your decrees out in a reasonable amount of time. It does you no good to rule Greece if you can't get your decrees out to Greece by the time they're expected to obey them. So one of the things the Persians did was they invented the Pony Express. All right? Consider Acts chapter 2, verses 8 through 11, which I've got up on the board there. It says, "How is it that each of us can hear in our own native language? Parthians, Medes, Elamites, those who live in Mesopotamia, in Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya near Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs, we hear them speaking the magnificent acts of God in our own languages." Just the people named up here, that's a lot of different languages. You also had Akkadian and Persian. So those two things are working against you. So if you look at Esther chapter 1 and verse 22, it says, "He sent letters to all the royal provinces, to each province in its own script, and to each ethnic group in its own language, that every man should be master of his own house and speak in the language of his own people." Herodotus describes the Persian postal system, so he was a fan. And what's really interesting is what he did was they set up essentially a chain of couriers to take mail along the royal road. Herodotus writes, there is nothing in the world which travels faster than the Persian couriers. The whole idea is a Persian invention and works like this. Riders are stationed along the road equal in number to the number of days the journey takes, a man and a horse for each day. Nothing stops these couriers from covering their allotted stage in the quickest possible time, neither snow, rain, heat, nor darkness. The first, at the end of his stage, passes the dispatch to the second to the third, and so on along the line, as in the Greek torch race, which is held in honor of Hephaestus. Now, you might recognize part of that statement, that nothing stops the couriers, neither snow, rain, heat, nor darkness. We've kind of adopted that for our postal service, haven't we? Nothing stops the mail from getting where it's supposed to go. Used to. Fair point. But if you look at Esther chapter 8 and verse 10, which I've got up there, it says, he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus, sealed it with the king's signet ring, and sent letters by couriers on horses, riding on steeds sired by the royal stud. So this was how Persia was as large as it was. They invented a mail system that allowed them to get their decrees and their mail out to the farthest corners of their empire in as quick a time as they possibly could. All right. Now, what is the purpose of the book of Esther? We'll talk a little bit more about that. But in general, what would you say the purpose of the book is? We've talked about the theme, but what's the purpose?
God's care for his people, fulfilling his promises.
Okay. That's one thing that we can take from it, but it has another purpose. Okay, again, I would say that's more of a theme than a purpose. What's established in the book of Esther? Purim. Okay, the holiday feast. So the part of the purpose of the book of Esther is to give us the background on the founding of the Feast of Purim. Oh, that's Persian Empire. Actually, I like this slide. This is the Persian Empire in the 5th century. You can see where modern countries are overlaid with the Persian Empire. So you can see it went all the way from Egypt through Turkey, through modern-day Iran, which is where Persepolis is, all the way pretty much to the Indian subcontinent. It was a sizable empire. All right, here's the annual feasts and seasons. Now, I want you to take a look at the chart on the slides. Where do most of the feasts come from? Where are they detailed? Almost all of them. Leviticus, right? Almost all the feasts mentioned up on that slide except for 2. What are the 2 that aren't? Okay, Purim is one, and the other one is Hanukkah. So those are the only 2 Jewish feasts that are not mentioned in the book of Leviticus. So if you're a Jew and you're celebrating the Feast of Purim, you kind of want to know, why are we doing this? And the book of Esther used to be called the book of Purim because it was the explanation for why they had the Feast of Purim. All right, so you have Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread, First Fruits, Pentecost, Rosh Hashanah, which is the Jewish New Year, Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement, Sukkot, which is the Feast of Tabernacles, all described in the book of Leviticus. Ooh, I'm running out of time. All right. During the Feast of Lots, the book of Esther is read, and there are appointed times when the book must be read, given by Esther chapter 9, verses 20 through 32. All right. For the sake of time, I'm going to run through this real fast. Mordecai recorded these events and sent letters to all the Jews in all of King Ahasuerus' provinces, both near and far. He ordered them to celebrate the 14th and 15th days during the month of Adar every year, because during those days the Jews got rid of their enemies. This was the month when their sorrow was turned into rejoicing and their mourning into a holiday. They were to be days of feasting, rejoicing, and of sending gifts to one another and the poor. So the Jews agreed to continue the practice they had begun, as Mordecai had written them to do. For Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of all Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them. He cast the poor, that is the lot, to crush and destroy them. But when the matter was brought before the king, he commanded by letter that the evil plan Haman had devised against the Jews return on his own head, and that he should be hanged with his sons on the gallows. For this reason, these days are called Purim, from the word pur. Because of all the instructions in this letter, as well as what they had witnessed and what had happened to them, the Jews bound themselves, their descendants, and all who joined with them, with the commandment that they would not fail to celebrate these 2 days, each and every year, according to the written instructions and according to the time appointed. These days are remembered and celebrated by every generation, family, province, and city, so that these days of Purim will not lose their significance in Jewish life, and the memory will not fade from their descendants. Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, along with Mordecai the Jew, wrote this second letter with full authority to confirm the letter about Purim. He sent letters with messages of peace and faithfulness to all the Jews who were in the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, in order to confirm these days of Purim at their proper time, just as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had established them, and just as they had committed themselves and their descendants to the practices of fasting and lamentation. So Esther's command confirmed these customs of Purim, which were then written into the record. All right. Now, what I've got up there is an excerpt from the Mishnah Megillah, the appointed times. The scroll of Esther is read on the 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, or 15th day of Adar. No earlier, no later. Cities surrounded by a wall from the time of Joshua ben Nun read the scroll of Esther on the 15th. Villages and large towns read it on the 14th. But villages push it up a day, they read it a day early, to a day of assembly on a Monday or a Thursday. There's a whole lot more rules like this in the Mishnah, which is really interesting. But it boils down to, they read from the book of Esther to everyone to explain the feast that they're going to have, and then they have it at this appointed time. And it's interesting that the Jews not only bound themselves to it, but also their descendants. They said, everybody is going to do this. All right. So next week, we're going to go into an overview of the book itself, and then hopefully we will start in on chapter 1. Any questions or comments on what we've gone over this morning so far? All right. If there's nothing else, we'll go ahead and close it out for this morning. So my plan is, we'll get through chapter 1 next week. I have 8 classes total. We've just gone through the first one. So we're going through the end of February. So the overview in chapter 1 will be for the next class. And then after that, we'll probably need to cover about a chapter and a half to 2 chapters per week in order to get through everything that we've got prepared. All right. Thank you for your attention this morning and your participation. I appreciate it.